"Step away from the gate," Richard Collins barked, his voice slicing through the quiet morning air with the certainty of a man who had never been told he was wrong. And every conversation inside the luxurious Hawthorne Ridge Villa community seemed to stop at once as residents walking tiny dogs, landscapers trimming perfect hedges, and delivery drivers unloading gourmet groceries all turned toward the entrance where a tall black man in a charcoal polo shirt, dark jeans, and worn leather sneakers stood beside a modest gray SUV with one hand resting on a sealed legal envelope, his expression calm enough to make the tension around him feel even louder, while Security Officer Mark Turner folded his arms and planted himself in front of the polished iron gate, as if the neighborhood itself depended on keeping one quiet stranger outside. And receptionist Olivia Hayes looked through the glass security booth before letting out a small laugh that carried farther than she expected. "You seriously think you belong in here?" she asked, earning a few uncomfortable smiles from people who suddenly wished they were somewhere else. But the stranger never looked away from the gate, never raised his voice, never defended himself. He simply glanced at the bronze community sign reflecting the morning sun and then back at Richard as if measuring something far more important than an argument. "I'm here on official business," he replied in a steady tone, extending the envelope with a gold court seal that nobody bothered to examine. Richard barely glanced at it before pushing it back across the counter. "Official business requires an appointment, and people like you don't just walk into Hawthorne Ridge," he answered, each word landing heavier than the last. While a young maintenance employee named Grace Wilson paused with a clipboard in her hands because she could have sworn she had seen that same last name on an email marked urgent before sunrise. Yet the manager's confidence filled the space before doubt had a chance to breathe. Across the driveway, a resident named Daniel Cooper slowed his morning jog and frowned at what he was seeing, his instincts telling him the man outside the gate looked remarkably composed for someone supposedly causing trouble. And standing near the mailbox cluster, attorney Sophia Reed quietly removed her sunglasses after noticing the untouched court seal catching the light. But before anyone spoke another word, Olivia folded her arms and smiled, as if the outcome had already been decided. "This neighborhood isn't open for sightseeing," she said. "Turn around before you waste everybody's time." The stranger simply checked the silver watch on his wrist and looked back at the closed gate, the silence around him growing so complete that even the fountain behind the guardhouse seemed louder than before, and for reasons none of them could explain, every person watching suddenly had the uneasy feeling that the wrong man was being kept outside. Ethan Brooks remained exactly where he was, not because the locked gate forced him to stay, but because nothing about the moment seemed capable of moving him before he chose to move himself. And that quiet confidence unsettled people more than anger ever could. While Richard Collins interpreted silence as surrender and straightened his expensive jacket with the satisfaction of a man convinced he had protected the neighborhood from an unwanted visitor, Olivia Hayes returned to her computer with a smirk and whispered to a delivery driver that some people watch too many television shows and believe confidence could replace credentials. But Ethan simply looked around the entrance as if he had arrived early for an appointment that everyone else had forgotten, taking in the stone walls, the perfectly trimmed oak trees, the fountain flowing beside the guard station, and the polished brass letters spelling Hawthorne Ridge, details that seemed ordinary to everyone else, yet somehow carried the weight of memory in his steady eyes, because he had spent years walking into rooms where strangers judged the color of his skin before hearing the sound of his voice. And every lesson had taught him the same thing. Patience revealed character faster than confrontation. Grace Wilson continued staring at the legal envelope in his hand, her mind returning to the urgent message she had printed before 7 o'clock that morning, an email mentioning immediate executive authority, court documentation, and a last name she could not stop repeating in her head, Brooks. While Daniel Cooper slowed his morning run until it became a walk and finally stopped beside the mailbox pavilion, noticing that the visitor carried himself with the relaxed posture of someone arriving at his own front porch instead of someone desperately trying to gain entry, Sophia Reed quietly studied the untouched gold seal and noticed something Richard had ignored. The county emblem pressed into the paper with official certification that attorneys rarely questioned and experienced managers never dismissed without reading. Yet Richard waved another resident through the security gate while deliberately leaving Ethan outside, Convinced appearances had already answered every important question. A luxury sedan rolled past, and its driver glanced at Ethan before nodding politely, receiving the same calm nod in return. A simple exchange that somehow made Olivia uncomfortable, because people who were pretending usually talked too much and explained too much, but this man did neither. He checked his watch once more, folded his hands around the envelope, and waited as if time itself had agreed to work in his favor. A light breeze carried the scent of fresh grass across the entrance while the morning sun reflected from the sealed document, creating a brief flash that caught Sophia's attention again, and she took one slow step closer before stopping. Realizing that the entire scene felt less like a visitor being denied access and more like a room full of people unknowingly taking a test they had already begun to fail. While Ethan looked toward the closed gate one final time and quietly said, almost to himself, but loud enough for those nearest to hear, every locked door eventually reveals whether it was protecting people or protecting prejudice. The quiet at the entrance slowly disappeared as more residents gathered near the stone walkway, curiosity spreading through Hawthorne Ridge faster than any neighborhood newsletter ever could. And with every new pair of eyes, Richard Collins seemed to stand a little taller, mistaking an audience for validation, while Olivia Hayes folded her arms and spoke with effortless confidence, telling anyone willing to listen that the man outside the gate had arrived without authorization and refused to leave, even though Ethan Brooks had never taken a single step toward the property line, never argued, and never once asked for special treatment. He simply held the sealed envelope and waited with the patience of someone who understood that truth had its own schedule. Mark Turner glanced from Ethan to Richard and back again before moving half a step closer to the gate, as if reinforcing an invisible barrier, a gesture that caused several residents to exchange uncertain looks because the visitor appeared remarkably composed compared to the people trying to keep him out. Daniel Cooper finally broke the silence by asking, did anyone actually read the paperwork he brought? But Richard answered before anyone else could speak, there is nothing worth reading. His certainty hanging in the air like a locked door. Sophia Reed watched the exchange carefully and noticed that Ethan never interrupted anyone, never defended his reputation, and never attempted to impress the crowd. Instead, he observed every face with calm attention, almost as though he were memorizing a room before an important meeting. Grace Wilson tightened her grip on her clipboard until the edges bent slightly, because she could now remember exactly where she had seen the name Brooks, printed across an emergency legal notice marked immediate implementation. Yet every time she considered mentioning it, Richard's voice filled the space first, directing deliveries, greeting homeowners, and casually dismissing the stranger with polished confidence. Olivia leaned toward another resident and whispered, people show up every year, pretending they belong somewhere they do not. But the words landed differently than she expected because several neighbors had already begun noticing details that did not fit her story. The visitor's polished shoes worn from use rather than neglect, the expensive but understated watch, the perfect composure, and the official county seal reflecting sunlight from the envelope nobody wanted to touch. Even the delivery driver who had been unloading specialty groceries paused long enough to say, he looks more patient than most executives I meet, earning only an irritated glance from Richard, while Ethan quietly checked the time again and slipped the envelope beneath his arm, his eyes lifting toward the security cameras positioned above the gate before returning to the crowd. And for the first time he spoke directly to everyone instead of the manager, his voice steady enough to silence every side conversation. Interesting things happen when people decide who belongs before they decide to read the facts. And the fountain continued flowing behind the guardhouse while an uneasy stillness settled across the entrance because somewhere beneath polished sidewalks, luxury landscaping, and million-dollar homes, certainty had begun to crack. Grace Wilson could no longer ignore the uneasy feeling growing inside her because every detail in front of her matched the document she had printed before sunrise, the same last name, the same county seal, the same instruction marked immediate and confidential. And as conversations continued around the entrance, she quietly stepped closer to the security desk, opened the electronic log, and searched once more until the word Brooks appeared on the screen exactly where she remembered it, causing her heartbeat to quicken while Richard Collins continued greeting residents as though the situation had already been settled. Olivia Hayes casually laughed with a homeowner about people trying to enter exclusive neighborhoods without invitations. And Mark Turner stood beside the gate with practiced confidence, even though his eyes drifted toward the envelope every few seconds. Daniel Cooper noticed Grace staring at the monitor and asked softly if everything was all right. But before she could answer, Sophia Reed walked beside her and caught a brief glimpse of the display, recognizing legal terminology that ordinary administrative files never contained. She slowly removed her reading glasses and looked toward Ethan Brooks, who remained completely still beneath the morning sun, with one hand resting on the sealed envelope and the other in his pocket, carrying himself with the quiet certainty of someone who had nothing to prove because facts would eventually speak for him. Grace finally gathered enough courage to clear her throat and said, almost in a whisper, "I think his name is connected to today's legal authorization." But Richard immediately dismissed her words with a wave of his hand and replied that computer systems made mistakes every day, adding that appearances still mattered and experience told him exactly what he was seeing, his confidence drawing a few nods from neighbors while others exchanged uncertain glances. Sophia looked directly at the untouched envelope and calmly asked if anyone had actually opened it, receiving only silence in return because no one wanted to admit that assumptions had replaced procedure. Ethan watched the exchange without interrupting and simply shifted his attention toward the security cameras mounted above the entrance before looking back at the crowd. A gentle breeze moved through the oak trees and carried the sound of the fountain across the driveway, making the growing silence feel even heavier. One elderly resident quietly remarked that he had served on enough community boards to know official court seals were never decorative. Another homeowner folded her arms and stepped a little farther away from Richard, sensing that certainty was beginning to crack beneath polished words. Grace swallowed her hesitation and looked again at the monitor, where one line remained impossible to ignore: executive legal transfer pending confirmation, while Sophia slowly nodded as though pieces of an invisible puzzle had finally started fitting together, and Ethan met Grace's anxious eyes with a calm expression that seemed to reassure rather than pressure her, saying only one sentence in a voice so steady that everyone nearby stopped talking to listen: "The truth never rushes because it already knows where it is going." And for the first time since the stranger arrived outside the gate, the crowd stopped looking at his clothes and started looking at the envelope nobody had wanted to read. Richard Collins finally reached for the sealed envelope with the confidence of a man convinced paper could never challenge his opinion, lifting it between two fingers before giving Ethan Brooks a thin smile that carried more judgment than courtesy. "Official documents do not change common sense," he said loudly enough for every resident near the gate to hear. And Olivia Hayes nodded with quiet satisfaction, while Mark Turner remained beside the entrance watching the growing crowd instead of the visitor. But the moment Richard turned the envelope over without opening it and casually placed it on the security counter as though it held no importance, a strange silence settled across the entrance, the kind that arrives when people begin questioning their own certainty. Ethan never reached for the document and never protested its treatment. He simply watched with calm eyes that seemed far older than the moment itself, and somewhere inside that silence another memory quietly returned. 23 years earlier, a younger Ethan had stood outside an office building wearing his only press shirt, carrying a scholarship letter that no one bothered to read because a receptionist decided he looked like he had entered the wrong address. He remembered waiting nearly an hour while executives walked past without making eye contact until an elderly janitor had finally picked up the forgotten envelope and smiled before saying, "Sometimes people judge the messenger so quickly that they never open the message," words that had followed him through every boardroom and every success afterward. And now those same words echoed beneath the stone entrance of Hawthorne Ridge as residents looked from the untouched court seal to the man standing quietly beside it. Grace Wilson could no longer hide her concern and softly repeated that the legal file deserved to be reviewed before any decision was made. But Richard answered with a dismissive laugh and folded his arms. Olivia added another remark that people often borrowed confidence to hide a lack of credentials, causing several homeowners to exchange uncomfortable glances because the visitor had shown nothing except patience. Sophia Reed slowly stepped toward the counter and fixed her eyes on the county seal, recognizing the official embossing that attorneys spent years learning never to ignore. Daniel Cooper noticed that Ethan had not checked his watch again, and somehow that made the atmosphere even heavier, as though waiting itself had become part of a plan nobody else understood. A child riding a bicycle through the neighborhood slowed beside the fountain and innocently asked his father why the man outside was still waiting if he had papers, and the father found himself without an answer. Because every explanation sounded weaker the longer Ethan remained composed. Finally, Richard looked directly at Ethan and delivered the sentence that made several heads turn. People like you do not end up running places like this. Expecting anger but receiving only a calm expression and a quiet reply that drifted through the morning air with surprising clarity. The most expensive gates in America have never been made of iron. They have always been made of assumptions, and no one standing near the entrance realized that the invisible countdown had already begun. Ethan Brooks slowly looked at the face of his watch, and for the first time since arriving outside the gate, a faint smile appeared. Not a smile of victory, but the quiet confidence of someone watching a clock reach exactly the moment he expected. While Richard Collins mistook that calm expression for surrender and casually adjusted his tie before announcing to the small crowd that the matter was over and normal operations would continue. Olivia Hayes returned to the security desk with exaggerated confidence and began organizing visitor forms she assumed would never include Ethan's name. Mark Turner relaxed his shoulders but kept one hand resting on the electronic gate control, unaware that every passing second was carrying the entire community toward a different future. Grace Wilson could no longer ignore the legal notice glowing on her computer screen and whispered to Sophia Reed that the file status had just changed from pending to active. Sophia quietly read the update without saying a word, and her professional expression shifted almost imperceptibly. Daniel Cooper noticed the change and followed her gaze toward the monitor, where a new line appeared beneath the county reference number. Effective immediately upon service, Richard continued speaking over everyone else, convinced authority belonged to the loudest voice in the conversation. But Ethan calmly reached into his pocket, removed his phone, and placed a single call that lasted less than 15 seconds. "Rebecca, Legal Protocol 7 is now active," he said in the same steady tone he had used all morning. "I am at the front entrance, and everything is proceeding exactly as expected." He ended the call, slipped the phone away, and returned to silence. Olivia laughed softly and looked toward the residence. "He thinks one phone call changes reality." But no one answered because several people had already begun noticing unfamiliar black vehicles turning onto the boulevard leading toward Hawthorne Ridge, moving at a measured pace without lights or urgency, simply arriving with quiet purpose. The fountain continued its steady rhythm while the breeze carried leaves across the stone driveway, creating the strange feeling that even the neighborhood itself was waiting. Grace refreshed the legal portal one more time, and her eyes widened as multiple authorization notices appeared simultaneously, each bearing the same county seal printed on the untouched envelope still resting on the security counter. Sophia finally spoke in a calm voice that carried surprising weight. "Richard, someone should open that document before another decision is made." But he shook his head and replied that appearances had already told him everything he needed to know. Ethan looked toward the approaching vehicles and then back at the closed gate, his expression unchanged, before quietly saying a sentence that reached every person standing nearby. There are moments when power does not announce itself. It simply arrives with paperwork. And as the first vehicle slowed to a stop outside the entrance, the conversations faded, the smiles disappeared. And even those who had agreed with Richard found themselves staring not at the man they had judged all morning, but at the sealed envelope they had refused to read. The first black sedan came to a smooth stop beside the stone entrance, and a second vehicle quietly followed behind it, not with flashing lights or dramatic urgency, but with the calm precision of people who already knew exactly why they had arrived. Every conversation around the gate faded into silence as two attorneys stepped onto the sidewalk carrying leather portfolios marked with the county seal, followed by a deputy clerk who greeted Ethan Brooks with a respectful nod before turning toward the security desk. Richard Collins forced a confident smile and began explaining that an unauthorized visitor had created unnecessary confusion, but the deputy clerk politely raised one hand and asked a single question that instantly changed the atmosphere. "Who is responsible for accepting official service on behalf of Hawthorne Ridge?" Richard answered without hesitation that he was the acting community manager, and the clerk carefully opened the sealed envelope that had remained untouched all morning, removed several stamped documents, and placed them on the polished counter where everyone could see the signature of the county judge beneath the bold words "Court-ordered transfer of executive authority." Grace Wilson covered her mouth in disbelief. As the same file she had seen on her computer appeared in physical form, Sophia Reed stepped forward, read the first page, and slowly nodded because every line followed proper legal procedure. Daniel Cooper watched neighbors lean closer until the entire entrance felt less like a private community and more like a courtroom under open skies. Olivia Hayes searched the faces around her for reassurance, but found only uncertainty. Mark Turner quietly lowered his hand from the gate controls as the deputy clerk continued reading. Effective immediately, Ethan Brooks was appointed court-authorized executive administrator with full operational authority over Hawthorne Ridge pending judicial restructuring. All current management decisions were subject to his review and compliance. The words settled over the entrance with the weight of undeniable fact. Richard stared at the documents as though reading them might somehow change them. Ethan accepted a certified copy without celebration, without a smile, and without even looking toward the people who had questioned him for the last hour. Instead, he calmly thanked the clerk and placed the papers back inside the envelope before turning toward Richard with the same measured voice that had never once risen above conversation. "You decided who belonged here before you decided to read the law." Nobody moved. Even the fountain seemed quieter than before. Ethan looked once across the gathering of residents, and then added the sentence that every witness would remember long after the morning ended. "You blocked the man the court placed in charge because you trusted assumptions more than facts." Sophia closed her portfolio. Daniel slowly shook his head. Grace finally released the breath she had been holding, and one by one the neighbors who had silently watched the confrontation realized that the calm stranger outside the gate had never been asking for permission to enter. He had simply been waiting for the truth to arrive. No applause came at first because the truth had arrived too quietly for anyone to understand its full weight, and the only sound filling the entrance of Hawthorne Ridge was the steady flow of water from the stone fountain as Richard Collins stared at the court order that had erased an entire morning of certainty with a single signature. Olivia Hayes instinctively reached for her keyboard and attempted to pull up the community management dashboard only to watch the screen refresh and display a new authorization banner assigning executive administrative control to Ethan Brooks. The expression on her face changing from confidence to disbelief without a single dramatic word being spoken. Mark Turner glanced at the electronic gate panel as an alert appeared requesting verification from the newly appointed administrator. His access level remaining active for security operations, but no longer granting supervisory authority, and he slowly stepped aside without being asked because procedure had finally replaced assumption. Grace Wilson refreshed the internal system again and watched every pending legal notice synchronize in real time, while Sophia Reed carefully organized the certified documents and quietly confirmed that every transfer had already been recorded with the county, leaving no room for argument or interpretation. Residents who had watched from a distance began walking closer, not out of curiosity anymore, but out of respect for the calm man who had never demanded recognition even when denied basic courtesy. Daniel Cooper extended his hand and introduced himself, admitting that he had expected frustration but had witnessed patience instead. Ethan accepted the handshake with an easy smile and thanked him without mentioning the insults that had filled the morning. Because his attention was already focused on something larger than personal pride, he looked toward the entrance, the gardens, the sidewalks, and the families beginning their day, then turned back to the gathering crowd and asked Grace if every employee had received the Community Standards Handbook during orientation. She quietly answered yes, and Ethan nodded before, saying that policies mattered only when they were applied equally to everyone who approached the gate. Olivia lowered her eyes as neighbors remembered every dismissive comment they had heard only minutes earlier. Richard attempted to explain that he had only been protecting the neighborhood, but the explanation seemed smaller each time he repeated it because the official documents resting on the counter carried more credibility than assumption ever could. Ethan simply replied that protecting a community should never begin by judging a person before reading the facts, and several homeowners nodded in agreement. One elderly resident remarked that he had lived there for 20 years and had never seen such a powerful lesson delivered without anger. Another quietly added that respect looked different than he had imagined. The deputy clerk completed the final verification. The attorneys packed their portfolios, and the black sedans departed as calmly as they had arrived, leaving behind no spectacle, no raised voices, and no celebration. Only a neighborhood forced to confront the invisible gate it had built long before the iron won at its entrance. While Ethan Brooks stood beneath the morning sun, holding nothing more than a sealed folder and the authority of the law, proving that dignity could change an entire room without ever asking permission. Ethan Brooks waited until the last county vehicle disappeared beyond the oak-lined boulevard before taking his first step through the gate that had remained closed to him all morning, and no one rushed ahead or tried to speak, because the silence itself had become a lesson more powerful than any apology. The polished iron doors stood open without resistance, while sunlight stretched across the stone pathway leading into Hawthorne Ridge, making the entrance feel strangely different even though nothing about the architecture had changed. Daniel Cooper watched families continue their morning walks with a new awareness that luxury neighborhoods could build invisible walls long before they built physical ones. Grace Wilson carefully saved every legal document into the community archive, knowing that one ordinary Tuesday would be remembered for years. Sophia Reed closed her portfolio and smiled quietly because justice had arrived exactly as it should, through patience, procedure, and truth instead of conflict. Olivia Hayes looked around at neighbors who no longer shared her certainty and finally understood that assumptions spoken confidently could still be completely wrong. Richard Collins remained beside the security desk, staring at the open gate until Ethan stopped a few feet away and met his eyes with the same calm expression that had never changed from the moment he arrived. There was no anger waiting for him, no demand for humiliation, only a simple invitation to reflect. Communities become stronger when people are welcomed by facts instead of judged by appearances, Ethan said, the words settling gently across the entrance as several residents nodded in agreement. One elderly homeowner quietly admitted that he had almost believed the loudest voice instead of the evidence. Another neighbor thanked Grace for speaking up when it would have been easier to stay silent. Children rode bicycles past the fountain without understanding the significance of the morning, while their parents looked at them and silently hoped they would grow up measuring character before appearance. Ethan accepted a set of administrative keys from the deputy clerk's assistant and handed them to Grace with instructions to review every visitor policy, every employee guideline, and every community standard so that respect would become procedure rather than personal opinion. Mark Turner listened carefully and promised that every future guest would be greeted first and judged never, earning a quiet smile from Ethan that carried more encouragement than praise. The fountain continued flowing. The gardens remained perfectly trimmed, and the expensive homes stood exactly where they had always stood. Yet the neighborhood itself somehow felt transformed because the most important gate had never been made of iron or stone. It had existed inside assumptions waiting to be challenged. Ethan looked once more toward the entrance where he had patiently waited with nothing but a sealed envelope and confidence in the law. Then continued walking forward beneath the morning sun and left behind one final thought that echoed through Hawthorne Ridge long after the conversations ended. I never raised my voice. I simply refused to lower my dignity. And when dignity stands beside truth, even the strongest gate eventually opens.